So let's go ahead and go into our palette here and choose a plane 3D, drag it on our canvas, go into edit mode and hit make polymesh 3D. And we've already touched a little bit on this. If we go in here to geometry, dynamic subdiv, there's a whole bunch of dynamic options in here, and there's some really cool stuff you can do. One of those is you can turn on dynamic, and by default smooth subdiv is going to be at 2. So if we turn on our polyframe here, it's not going to look that different. The corners get a little rounded, but other than that, there's not a whole lot of difference there. In fact, let's go in here to our material and choose sketch shaded 2 so we can see a little bit better. So we turn dynamic off. Basically, the corners just get a little bit rounded. However, what it's really doing is giving us a smooth subdiv of 2 preview. So if I go through here and I grab my move brush and I pull these points up, you're going to see, if I turn polyframe off, I get a very, we'll switch back over to start material, we get a very smooth fall off here. And now when I turn dynamic off, you're going to see, oh, it's actually pretty low res. There's not a whole lot of geometry going on here, but when we turn on dynamic, it gives us a preview of what this mesh would look like if I hit subdivide twice. Now, why this is important is if you were to actually hit subdivide twice, if I turn off dynamic and I hit divide, divide, and then let's say I wanted to go through here and maybe extrude these faces. So I'm going to go in my ZModeler brush, BZM, hover over a face and say extrude polygroup all and try to pull up. It's not going to let me. It's going to say it's composed of multiple subdivision levels and it's going to stop the action. So you're going to notice that when you use actual subdivision levels, it's going to really limit what you can do to your object. So instead of actually putting real subdivision levels, we just undo back to where we have dynamic. We can preview what it would look like smooth, but we can also hit Shift D to turn dynamic off or D to turn dynamic on. And when you do that for the first time, it'll say, are you sure you want to activate? Say yes. And now you can do Shift D and D to turn dynamic on and off. So now what I can do is I can do Shift D to turn that off. And I can go through here and I can say, like I was going to do before, extrude polygroup all, and I can pull out an extrusion, or I can alt paint on here and I can continue modeling, or maybe alt paint through here and say Q mesh polygroup all and pull these out and have them snap like so. And then if I want to, I can again turn on dynamic, and that'll give me a preview of what it would look like if I went and hit Control D to subdivide and smooth. However, it'll allow me the freedom to go through here and change geometry too. So this is a really good way to preview what your mesh would look like smooth without having to commit to it and limiting your options. Now let's undo back all the way back to the beginning of our undo history. Just grab that slider and pull it all the way to the left. And we'll turn polyframe back on. So another thing that's a little less destructive than what we just did is when we turn on dynamic, we'll have smooth set to 2. There's also a thickness slider. So I can take this thickness slider up, and that'll give us essentially fake thickness. So if I turn off polyframe, you're going to see I can see both sides of the object here, and if I snap to the side, there's a little bit of a thickness to that plane, and I can make this thicker or thinner as needed. However, just like smooth subdiv, I can do Shift D, and that turns off all these dynamic properties. So this entire block right here is just dynamic. I can turn it on and off at a whim. So now let's talk a little bit more about this smooth subdivision property. So let's go to grab a polymesh 3D star out of our palette if you need to. Let's go all the way to the bottom, choose initialize, Q cube with a resolution of 2. We'll go ahead and turn on our polyframe here. If we go back up here to dynamic and turn this on, you're going to see it didn't inherit any of the properties we changed on that other tool. It started out as a fresh tool, so all of these have been reset. So we're back to a smooth subdiv of 2. And you're going to see the result of that is just kind of smoothing our mesh. So if I do Shift D, it turns it off. And again, if I hit Control D twice or hit divide twice, you're going to get the exact same result as turning on dynamic, only this is destructive. We'll have subdivision surfaces here and subdivision history, but now I can't use ZModeler. So instead, let's hit Control Z back to where we had no subdivision history, and now I can do Shift D to turn this on and off as needed. So there was a couple things we skipped when we were in ZModeler brush. So if I hover over an edge, there was a crease option, so Crease Edge here. And you'll also notice underneath dynamic, we also have underneath edge loop, we have dynamic and creasing, and these work really well together. So if I turn on dynamic, by default, smooth subdiv of 2 is set. So again, like we discussed, this is giving you a preview of what it's going to look like when you subdivide this mesh 2 times. Now if I go through here and hover over an edge now, you're going to see we have our control edge here, so we can kind of see like this is where our object actually is. And then if we do Shift D, you can see that a little clearer. And then when we hit D, you're going to see this is what our object is going to look like. So now you can go through here, and if you hover over an edge, hold down spacebar, change this to Crease Edge, you can go through here and you can crease an edge. So we'll crease this edge and this edge. You're going to see when we crease, it's going to hold that position a little bit better. In fact, you can hover over a face, and you can say Crease, Polygroup All, choose Outer Targets, All Edges, and then when I click on this, again, we have polygroups the same on both sides. So now it's going to take that entire polygroup border and crease it for me. If I do Shift D, you're going to see what it's doing is adding a creased line here. And if I zoom in a little bit and we change our material over here to Sketch Shaded 2, you're going to see there's a little dotted line there. Essentially what that's doing, if we hit D, is creasing that edge to maintain that edge. Now there's another way you can do that. If we do Shift D and we go over here to the crease options to say Uncrease All, if I hover over this edge and we say Insert Single Edge Loop, we can add in what's called a control loop here. So the closer I get this edge to this edge, and then I hit D for dynamic, and again we have that smooth subdiv here, that's going to make it so that the difference between those 2 points is a lot less than the difference between these 2 points. So if I do Shift D, this point and this point is going to average when I hit subdivide with the smooth modifier turned on. So I hit divide, you're going to see it's going to average those points, but if I undo that, these points are so close together, when I hit divide, it's going to maintain that edge even more. So the closer you put these edges, and again I'll hit D here to go into dynamic subdivision, the tighter it's going to keep that edge fall off here. So it's the exact same thing with creasing. If I do Control Z to get rid of that edge loop, or you can go in here to Insert Single Edge Loop and hold down Alt and just delete that edge loop here. Instead of going through and inserting an edge loop, I can go through here and say Crease Edge Loop Complete, and it's going to be a little bit difficult to like choose if it creases this face or this face. If you want, you can also go here and Crease Edge and literally just crease every single edge, or do like we did before and just crease this polygroup face. There's another option here. If we undo all that, you can hold down Control Shift and use your visibility to have an open border edge, and then when you hit this crease button, it'll crease any open border. So now when I hit D, it'll give us the exact same result. It'll give us a very clean creased edge that's going to hold its position without having to insert an edge loop. And the reason I like that is because when you start introducing more edges, like Insert Single Edge Loop to hold these positions, or go through here and we can say Inset Polygroup All Region. You know, we put in these control loops here and we uncrease everything. This will give us a result that's a little bit more tunable. So we can go through here and we can say Slide Edge Loop Complete. If we hover over an edge, hold down spacebar, Slide Edge Loop Complete. As we back this edge off, this fall off is going to get broader. As we move it forward, it's going to get tighter and tighter. So while you do have more control over that edge, it is also adding more geometry that you have to worry about. So the more complex your shapes get, the more difficult it might be to maintain all of those points. So what my usual rule of thumb is, crease first, and then if you need to, add in control loops. So let's go ahead and grab a cylinder out of our palette here, and let's say Make Polymesh 3D. And if we hit D for dynamic here, it's going to give us a smooth subdiv of 2, but you're going to see we're getting some scalloping on the top here. So to alleviate that, what we could do is we'll do Shift D to go out of dynamic mode. We're going to hover over an edge and say Insert Single Edge Loop, and we'll put an edge loop in here just to kind of maintain this shape. So again, we're putting an edge loop in here, so as this averages, it has something to average to, and we'll get a much smoother result along the top here. So if you compare the bottom here with all that scalloping to the top, this top is much smoother. Now, like I said before, if we go through here, and we still have dynamic turned on, so while we have dynamic turned on, we can actually insert edge loops on the fly. So if I go through here, and we have dynamic turned on, I can just put in edge loops, and you can see what those control loops are doing. As I move them closer together, it's going to make that much tighter, and down here, the fall off is much greater. So again, if I turn on Polyframe and hit Shift D, essentially all we did was put 2 edges close to each other. Now, like we mentioned before, if you hover over an edge, Insert Single Edge Loop with your spacebar, hold down Alt to get rid of that edge loop, you can still go through here and say Insert Multiple Edge Loops we'll go ahead and say keep polygroup, and then as we pull this out with interactive elevation turned on, you can go ahead and round this off as well. And that'll give you a lot of control over that exact curvature if you need that much control. But again, the more edges you add, the more edges you're going to have to keep track of. So in this instance, what I might do is just hit D to divide, and then that'll be my fall off. And if I need more resolution, I'm going to go over here to Smooth Subdiv and turn this up, and that'll give me a preview of what it would look like if I subdivided this 3 times instead of 2, giving me a smoother result. Or I can drop this down to 1, and if I turn it down to 0, there's no difference. If I turn dynamic off with Shift D and then D to turn it back on, there's no difference. So let's go ahead and turn dynamic on. We'll turn Smooth Subdiv up to 2 again. And for this bottom half that we haven't touched yet, I'll do Shift D. And there's a few other ways we can add edge control. So again, if we do a D for dynamic subdivision, we hover over an edge, we can say Crease Edge Loop Complete and just crease this entire edge. If it's difficult to select, if you can't quite see where it's happening, just do Shift D to turn it off. Go ahead and crease this entire edge, then turn dynamic back on with D, and you'll see this is the result you get. An alternative to that, like we already talked about, is holding down, let's hold down Control Z. We can hold down Control Shift to isolate this to make it an open border. Hit the crease button, and then that'll go ahead and be creased. So again, if we hit D for dynamic and smooth the div up back up to 2, we get the same result. And you can also use polygroups, and this is probably my preferred method. So let's hit Shift D, and I'm going to go over here and I say uncrease all. So none of my edges are creased now. I'm going to go all the way down here to our polygroup menu, and I'm going to choose group by normals. So as you're going to see, the max angle is set to 45. So this angle right here is 90 degrees. That's greater than 45. It'll go ahead and polygroup the top and the sides. And even through here it did too. This angle was severe enough for it to catch it. However, if I increase this max angle, it'll ignore polygroups. They still caught this one at max angle of 60, but this one it made it all one polygroup. So now the smaller we make it, the more likely it is to catch more of those angle changes. So if I get down here to 33, now it caught this plane change, and this middle one as well. So now that I have that information, we can go through here, and instead of going through every single edge and creasing edge loop complete, I can do it in one button press by going here to Crease PG, and that's going to crease all of my polygroup borders. So now when I hit D, this is the result I'm going to get. I get a nice crease along here and a nice crease along here and here. So let's go ahead and model this top part out. And if you remember, when we hit W and then Y and we're using transpose with scale and holding down control and pulling in edge rings, I said there was a way you can do it that was ZModeler too. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and hit Y to go back into gizmo mode. Control drag to unmask everything, hit Q to go back into draw mode, and then BZM to go back into ZModeler. Now we already have a control ring in here. If you want, you can say insert single edge loop, hold down Alt, and get rid of that. We can go through here and say inset polygroup all region, and we can inset here, and we can inset again, and then I can go through here and say Q mesh polygroup all, hold down Shift to pull along the surface normal, and then just continue to inset. So go back to inset here, we'll inset again, and then go back to Q mesh. Just hovering over face, holding down spacebar, Q mesh polygroup all, hold down Shift, and pull this in. So now we have a lot of differences in angles. So if I go back here to polygroup and I say group by normals, it's going to take all of those angle changes into account. And I can very quickly go back up here, say Crease PG, hit D to turn on dynamic, and now I have all of those edges creased. And if I decide, you know what, maybe one of these edges I don't want creased, I can now hover over an edge, say Crease Edge Loop Complete, hold down Alt, and uncrease these edges. So that'll give me that fall off. Now you're also going to see a Crease Level and a Smooth Subdiv. Smooth Subdiv we've already talked about, so the higher I make this, the more smooth it's going to get because it's giving you a preview of subdividing it 1, 2, 3, or 4 times. The Crease Level is going to work along with this number. So if I set the crease level to 15, it's going to stay creased all the way up to 15 subdivision levels, which I can't even hit through this preview. However, if I lower this number, say crease level of 2, and if I keep this at smooth subdiv of 2, I still get very tight creases. However, as soon as I move this smooth subdiv slider more than the crease level, I can change this to 3, and now it's a crease level of 2 and a smooth subdiv of 3. So essentially what this is doing, if I turn off dynamic, it's doing the exact same preview as if I was to go over here to say divide once, divide twice, uncrease all, and then divide one more time. And you're going to see what that does is give me kind of a nice fall off. And in fact, if I hit divide one more time, I get a very smooth result with a nice fall off on those edges. So it's not too sharp. And if you're going to bake something, this would be what I would bake to. So you get a nice highlight along that edge. So if we undo that, back to where we had no subdivisions, and then we had dynamic turned on, and we change it to smooth subdiv of 4, you're going to see you get the exact same preview result. Very nice highlight on the edge, but not super sharp. However, if I change my crease level from 2 to match this, so crease level of 2, 3, 4, now we're back to super razor sharp. Because again, the crease level is the exact same or more in this case. Let's change it back to 4. If it's the same or more, then it's always going to be super sharp. As soon as the crease level gets below the smooth subdiv level, crease level of 3, you can see you get a little bit of a fall off. Crease level of 2, you're going to get even more fall off. Crease level of 1, even broader. And if we go down here to 0, it's like it was never creased at all. So again, if you want a very broad, soft fall off, a crease level of 1 and a smooth subdiv of 4, there's a lot of difference between those, and it's basically telling it stay creased for one subdivision and then uncrease for the rest. Generally speaking, I'll do like a crease level of 2, smooth subdiv of 3, and that'll kind of be my working resolution as I'm previewing things. And again, the cool thing about not having real subdivision levels is I can always do Shift D, and I can continue to come in here and keep modeling. If I want to say, bevel, edge loop complete through here, and then say Q mesh, polygroup all, and push this in. I can hit D for dynamic subdivision, and then I'm back in here. Now at this point, if I go back and I say crease PG, it'll crease my polygroups, but it's also going to re-crease these edges up here. If I don't want to do that, I can just undo that, and then I can manually go through here and say crease edge loop complete on all these edges, and then I can hit D for my dynamic subdiv, and then I can make the decision, you know what, I can hold down Alt and maybe uncrease these edges in here if that's the look I'm going for. Now I personally prefer to use polygroups to show me where my creasing is going to go. So if I go in here and say crease PG, I already have a pretty good idea, even if I have subdivision off, where my creases are going to go. So when I hit D, there's no surprises. That's pretty much exactly what I'm looking for. And in fact, if I want to make sure that these don't get creased, I can just hold down Control Shift. We'll do Shift D, hold down Control Shift, grab these polygroups, Control Shift drag to invert that. Grab this purple one, invert, hit Control W, hit Control Shift to bring everything back. And now if I go over here to uncrease all and then crease PG, so uncrease all and then crease polygroup, now when I hit D, this is all one polygroup, and now I know it's just going to crease here and not those two top edges. Now there's another way to crease things very quickly. If I go here back here to uncrease all, and I hit Shift D to go out of dynamic mode, you're going to see I don't have any creasing on my edges, and in fact I can hit Control W and make it all one polygroup. So if I go down here to geometry and crease, you're going to see there's a crease tolerance number. So just like when we were doing polygroups and saying group by a certain angle, and I think the default is like 45, I can do group by normals and it'll grab all those polygroups. The exact same thing is going to happen if I go over here with a crease tolerance of 45, hit crease, it's going to look at those angles and crease every angle based on that angle threshold, which when it's set to 45 and I hit dynamic, it gives me the exact same result as polygrouping by normal angle. So that's another option to very quickly go through and crease your topology without having to manually go through and crease everything. Just use this angle tolerance to get the creasing that you need. And then you can go through here and say crease edge complete, hold down Alt, and uncrease any edges you don't want. Let's go ahead and hit Shift D, and while we're in the crease menu, we can go ahead and talk about this bevel. So if I go over here to the polyframe, we already have creases set on our object here. So if I crank this bevel up, it's going to look at my creases and put a bevel right along every single one of those. So if I do Shift D, you're going to see everywhere I had a crease, if I drag this slider, it'll go through and put a bevel along every single crease. An alternative to that, if I do Shift D, is if I go down here and I say polygroup, group by normals, now I have a normal along here. And again, if I want to, I can say Control Shift click these, Control Shift drag to invert, Control W to make it all one polygroup. And now, instead of using my creasing to determine my bevels, I can hold down Control and change this, and that's going to put a bevel in between every single one of my polygroups. So that's another option for you if you want to just put in some quick bevels, is to hold down Control and change your bevel width. And again, along every single polygroup border, it'll add a polygroup bevel. Now, you can have any polygon object selected, go down here to initialize and hit Q cube, or if you want to keep working on this later, let's grab a Polymesh 3D out of our palette, just that star, and then go down to the very bottom here, say initialize Q cube, and let's talk about some more options here. So, if we go back up here to Geometry, Dynamic, and we turn that on, you're going to see I get a Smooth Subdiv, but I also have this Q-Grid options. So let's turn Smooth Subdiv down to 0, and let's turn Q-Grid up. And if you turn off Polyframe, you're going to see what you're getting is a nice bevel along every single hard surface edge. And this coverage is going to change how big that fall off is. So Q-Grid is going to add resolution, and then coverage is going to change how broad that fall off is. And in fact, you can choose Bevel and Chamfer, or just Chamfer if you want a smoother fall off. And in fact, if you want a really smooth fall off, you can combine Q-Grid with a little bit of Smooth Subdiv. So if I change the Smooth Subdiv to 1 and keep Q-Grid up here, I can use Q-Grid to kind of keep my corners tight and then change my coverage here to get a bigger or smaller fall off. And again, this is all non-destructive, it's just a preview mesh. So if I do Shift D, that's going to turn it back to regular mode. So I'm going to hold down Alt and paint along here and say QMesh Polygroup All. Let's go ahead and turn on X Symmetry. So I can QMesh, I can hit Control W to make this all one polygroup, then Alt Paint on here and QMesh this out. Alt Paint here, QMesh this out. So again, just using basic QMesh functionality and making these nice blocky shapes. And then if I hit D to go back into Dynamic Subdiv and I turn off Polyframe, you can see this is a result I get. So I can sit here and sculpt or model, rather, in Q-Grid mode, and I'll get a very nice fall off. Now, where this can tend to break down, and again, all I'm really doing underneath the hood is just holding down Alt and painting and then Q-meshing out. So if I want to go through here and Alt paint this one and then move it over, you'll see it'll go through and just snap these together. I can Alt paint here and snap this forward, and it's got that fall off too, so I can get a nice little angle back. And I can do Shift D to turn all that off, and here's my real geo, and then D to turn that back on. Now, if you remember from the previous videos, where say we want to do, let's hit Shift D, let's hover over a face and say, hold down the space bar and choose delete a single poly. So I'll delete this poly and this poly. Hover over an edge and say bridge two holes. So we'll click here and then bridge these. Again, we have interactive elevation and interactive resolution. So pulling left and right is elevation, up and down is resolution, and we'll put a nice curve on this object. Now if I hit D to turn dynamic back on, or to click the dynamic button, you're going to see every single one of those faces is faceted. And that's not really what we're looking for in this particular instance. So you're going to see that Q-Grid is pretty good when it comes to very boxy shapes. However, it's going to kind of break down whenever you have curved shapes that you want to average these so you get a very nice smooth arc through here. So in this particular instance, what I'm going to have to do is turn Q-Grid off, and that's going to kind of, again, because we have Smooth Subdiv up to 1, it's going to kind of melt my object. However, we do know we can go down here to Geometry, Crease, and then we have the Crease Tolerance here, so we just click this. It's going to look at all of the angles on my object here and try and make good decisions about creasing. Now, I didn't get everything. We can try and drop this Crease Tolerance down a bit, but if you drop it too low, it's going to start creasing these small angles in between. However, it seemed at 22 seemed to catch this angle and not catch these angles, so it did a pretty good job. Of course, if you need to, you can always manually go through here, hover over an edge, say Crease Edge, go ahead and crease that edge and this edge, whatever you need to do. And now we have a nice smooth arc and creasing where we need to. Of course, if we want a nice fall off on these edges here, what we're going to have to do is say Crease Level of, say, 3, Smooth Subdiv of 4, and now we'll get the creasing. It'll subdivide 1, 2, 3 times, uncrease all, and then subdivide one more time. Again, not real geometry, just preview geometry, but that'll give us the best of both worlds. We can go through here and get our creasing, get our nice edge fall off, and we get the nice smooth arc along with the more blocky geometry. And in fact, you can mix creasing and subdivision levels with edge loop control. So you can see how this fall off is very broad. I can go through here, hover over an edge, hold down spacebar, say insert, single edge loop, and I can just put an edge loop right along here and tighten that edge up a little bit. So we're using creasing, we're using control loops. If I hit Shift D, you see we put in a little control loop right here to hold that edge a little bit better. And we're using smooth subdiv versus our crease level to get an edge fall off. Now, like I said before, this isn't real geometry, it's just a preview. So if I do Shift D, it all just goes back, and I can still go through here and hold down Alt and pull these things out, say maybe Q Mesh Polygroup All. Now when I do that and I hit D for subdivide, you're going to see it kind of does this result. Well, you're going to need to go back in here and hit that crease button again to crease these. And of course, if you want, you can go back in here and say Crease Edge and hold down Alt, and you can uncrease some of these edges to get that look, if that's what you're going for. But again, it's not real geometry. If you want to make it real geometry, and I would wait until it looks about how you would want. So if you wanted to bake this off, what you could do is say we have our subtool here. I can duplicate this off, and I can use this as our game res geo. I can do Shift D, and that'll give us our low res geo back. And you may have to make some slight modifications on these edges here where we made it super curvy. But most of your game res geo, quote unquote, is pretty much done. And then here, if we choose this one has dynamic here, and we're just going to go down here to dynamic and hit apply. Now you're going to see we have actual subdivision levels here. So this is real geometry now. So if I export this as an OBJ or an FBX, you can actually bake to this geo. And in fact, if we go in here to our move brush, we can move this stuff around. We can switch to our standard brush. There's geometry in here for us to sculpt on. So again, this is real geo. If we try to go back to this mesh here, and we have dynamic turned on, and then we try to go through here and sculpt, it's not going to do much. It'll do a little bit, but if I turn on polyframe and hit Shift D, you're going to see the reason I'm not able to sculpt on here is because there's no verts there. There's nothing for me to sculpt on until I hit apply. Now it's real geometry. Now if I turn off polyframe and turn it back on, you're going to see there's plenty of geometry in here for me to go in and sculpt on. So just keep in mind that until you hit that apply button, it's just preview geometry, not real geometry. Now when I have my subdivision here, if it goes down to subdivision level 1, this is the geometry, and then smooth subdiv is essentially just hitting Control D, and all your polygons here will be nice and equally subdivided. I'll have perfect subdivision history all the way through. However, if I go back here, let's go ahead and just take our mesh here, and we'll just say, give me another initialized Q cube. Oops. It's going to say if it has subdivision levels you can't convert it, just hit delete lower. And then that'll get rid of our subdivision levels. This will keep this geometry. And if you ever want to, you can hit this reconstruct subdiv and you can get your subdivision history back if you want. But again, you can say delete higher, go down here, initialize Q cube at res of 2. And we'll go back in here and we'll turn on dynamic. And instead of smooth, we'll turn that off. We'll take Q grid and crank that up. And then change our Q grid here. We'll say chamfer, and you know what? We'll do a smooth subdiv of 1. Now, if we want to see what geometry this is making, we can say apply, and now we turn on polyframe. You're going to see it's packing geometry around our where our edges are. And in fact, we do have subdivision history on this one, but that's because we used smooth subdiv history. If we go through here and we undo this, we say smooth subdiv of 0, and then we just use our Q grid and our coverage to go through here. You're going to see every single edge, even if it's not a edge that's controlling the shape of the mesh. If we go through here and we use BZM to go back to our Z modeler brush, say insert single edge loop and hold down Alt, even if I delete that edge, it doesn't really change the overall shape. It makes no difference. However, if you have an edge in there, it's going to want to put geometry around that edge. If you zoom in here, you're going to see very faintly it's packing resolution along every single edge. So you're going to see on either side of these, as I change this Q grid resolution, it packs more and more edges the higher that Q grid number gets. And then the coverage, of course, is going to take those edges and spread them further apart or closer together on every single edge of your object. And normally when it's very blocky meshes, it's just every visible edge you see. However, just keep in mind it is packing edges in internal edges that you have as well. So if I take this and we don't have smooth and we hit apply, you're going to see I don't have geometry here. And if I hit reconstruct, it's not going to be able to. All it's doing is packing edges on every single edge based on my Q-grid resolution, and my coverage is telling it these edges are packed closer or they're packed farther apart. So that's the difference between Q-grid and smooth subdiv. And again, you can use them both in conjunction. You can say, keep a slightly lower Q-grid and change that coverage down a bit and turn smooth subdiv up to 1 to get a nice smooth fall off here, like so. But then when you hit apply, you'll have one smooth subdiv and then a bunch of edges packed in here. So if I say delete lower, you'll see along this middle edge it packed a bunch of geometry. Along these edges it packed a lot of geometry. So just keep in mind, if you have any edges that aren't controlling the overall silhouette, it's going to increase edges along there, even if it doesn't need to. So let's go ahead and undo a couple times, or just drag the slider all the way back. And then we'll go back down here and we'll say, give me another Q cube initialize. There's another option in here. If we turn on dynamic, there's a flat subdiv. So if I change this to 2 and smooth subdiv down to 0, you're going to see the higher I crank this up, so flat subdiv of 5, and I hit apply, we do have subdivision history still, but it's the exact same thing as going over here to dynamic, or going over here to divide and turning off the smooth modifier. So again, we're getting subdivision levels. If I hit delete lower, we're getting tons of geometry. But if I undo that, Control Z, it's that flat subdiv that's making that option available to us. And of course you can mix this with smooth subdiv, but essentially all this is doing, if I go through here with my Z modeler brush, hold down Alt and Paint and pull out some of these surfaces here. If I go up here to geometry divide with the smooth modifier on, it's going to average those vertices. However, if I go over here and I say smooth modifier off and I hit, let's turn off dynamic, hit divide, divide, divide 3 times, and then I say, you know what? Let's turn it back on and hit divide. That's the result I'm going to get. It's going to give me a flat subdiv division up to 4, and then it's going to give me a smooth subdiv on that last one. And again, to be less destructive, we can preview that instead of committing to that. So again, we'll go in here to dynamic. We'll say flat subdiv of 3 with 1 smooth subdiv, and that's the exact result we get. Now the number doesn't need to be lower. Essentially what you're telling it is do 3 flat subdivisions, or do 3 divisions without smooth modifier, and then do 1 with a smooth modifier, or 2 with a smooth modifier, and that's the result you get. However, when I go up here and hit apply, you're going to see we don't just get 3 subdivisions or 2 subdivisions, we get 6. And that's because flat and smooth do give us subdivide geometry. So here's 1, 2, 3 flat, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 flat, and then 1, 2 smooth, and that's our end result. We get full subdivisions across both of those options. So that's this top part of dynamics in a nutshell.